Yes, okay, great. Of course, I can't hear you say yes, so luckily some people were. So this book was originally published in 1934, and it's fairly autobiographical. It sold very poorly, and it went out of print for almost 30 years. And then in October 1964, it was reviewed by a literary critic, and the review was on the front page of the New York Times Book Review. It was very, very favorable. And so Avon published it in paperback, and it sold over 1 million copies. I wish I could remember how I first came upon it, but I can't. Anyway, and then I will change my picture to give you a better idea of the setting. Is that clear at all? That might be difficult to see, but anyway, I'll get started. The small white steamer, Peter Stuyvesant, that delivered the immigrants from the stench and throb of the steerage to the stench and throb of New York tenements, rolled slightly on the water beside the stone quay in the lee of the weathered barracks and new brick buildings of Ellis Island. Her skipper was waiting for the last of the officials, laborers, and guards to embark upon her before he cast off and started for Manhattan. Since this was Saturday afternoon, and this was the last trip she would make for the weekend, those left behind might have to stay over till Monday. Her whistle bellowed its hoarse warning. A few figures in overalls sauntered from the high doors of the immigration quarters and down the gray pavement that led to the dock. It was May in the year 1907, the year that was destined to bring the greatest number of immigrants to the shores of the United States. All that day, as on all the days since spring began, her decks had been thronged by hundreds upon hundreds of foreigners, natives from almost every land in the world. The jowled, close-cropped Teuton, the full-bearded Russian, the scraggly whiskered Jew, and among them Slovak peasants with docile faces, smooth-cheeked and swarthy Armenians, pimply Greeks, Danes with wrinkled eyelids. All day her decks had been colorful, a matrix of the vivid costumes of other lands, the speckled green and yellow aprons, the flowered kerchief, embroidered homespun, the silver-braided sheepskin vest, the gaudy scarves, yellow boots, fur caps, caftans, dull gabardines. All day the guttural, the high-pitched voices, the astonished cries, the gasps of wonder, reiterations of gladness had risen from her decks in a motley billow of sound. But now her decks were empty, quiet, spreading out under the sunlight, almost as if the warm boards were relaxing from the strain and the pressure of the myriads of feet. All those steerage passengers of the ships that had docked that day who were permitted to enter had already entered, except two, a woman and a young child she carried in her arms. They had just come aboard escorted by a man. About the appearance of these latecomers, there was very little that was unusual. The man had evidently spent some time in America and was now bringing his wife and child over from the other side. It might have been thought that he had spent most of his time in lower New York, for he paid only the scantest attention to the Statue of Liberty, or to the city rising from the water, or to the bridges spanning the East River, or perhaps he was merely too agitated to waste much time on these wonders. His clothes were the ordinary clothes the ordinary New Yorker wore in that period, sober and dull. A black derby accentuated the sharpness and sedentary pallor of his face. A jacket loose on his tall, spare frame, buttoned up in a V close to the throat, and above the V, a tightly knotted black tie was mounted in the groove of a high-starched collar. As for his wife, one guessed that she was a European, more by the timid wondering in her eyes as she gazed from her husband to the harbor than by her clothes. For her clothes were American, a black skirt, a white shirtwaist, and a black jacket. Obviously, her husband had either taken the precaution of sending them to her while she was still in Europe, or had brought them with him to Ellis Island, where she had slipped them on before she left. Only the small child in her arms wore a distinctly foreign costume, an impression one got chiefly from the odd, outlandish blue straw hat on his head, with the polka dot ribbons of the same color dangling over each shoulder. Except for this hat, had the three newcomers been in a crowd, no one probably would have singled out the woman and child as newly arrived immigrants. They carried no sheets tied up in huge bundles, no bulky wicker baskets, No prized feather beds, no boxes of delicacies, sausages, virgin olive oils, rare cheeses. The large black satchel beside them was their only luggage. But despite this, despite their even less than commonplace appearance, the two overalled men sprawled out and smoking cigarettes in the stern eyed them curiously. And the old peddler woman, sitting with basket of oranges on knee, continually squinted her weak eyes in their direction. The truth was there was something quite untypical about their behavior. The old peddler woman on the bench and the overawed men in the stern had seen enough husbands meeting their wives and children after long absence to know how such people ought to behave. The most volatile races, such as the Italians, often danced for joy, rolled each other around, pirouetted in an ecstasy. Swedes sometimes just looked at each other, breathing through open mouths like a panting dog. Jews wept, jabbered, almost put each other's eyes out with the recklessness of their darting gestures. Poles roared and gripped each other at arm's length as though they meant to tear a handful of flesh. And after one pecking kiss, the English might be seen gravitating toward, but never quite achieving an embrace. But these two stood silent, apart, man staring with aloof, offended eyes grimly down at the water. Or if he turned his face toward his wife at all, it was only to glare in harsh contempt at the blue straw hat worn by the child in her arms. And then his hostile eyes would sweep about the deck to see if anyone else was observing them. And his wife beside him, regarding him uneasily, appealingly, and the child against her breast, looking from one to the other with watchful, frightened eyes. Altogether, it was a very curious meeting. They had been standing in this strange and silent manner for several minutes, when the woman, as if driven by the strain into action, tried to smile, and touching her husband's arm, said timidly, "And this is the Golden Land." She spoke in Yiddish. The man grunted, but made no answer. She took a breath as if taking courage, and tremulously, "I'm sorry, Albert, I was so stupid." She paused, waiting for some flicker of unbending, some word which never came. "But you look so lean, Albert, so haggard. And your mustache, you've shaved." His brusque glance stabbed and withdrew. "Even so. You must have suffered in this land," she continued, despite his rebuke. "You never wrote me. You're thin. Ugh. Then here in the new land is the same old poverty. You've gone without food. I can see it. You've changed." "Well, that don't matter," he snapped, ignoring her sympathy. "It's no excuse for your not recognizing me. Who else would call for you? Do you know anyone else in this land?" "No," placatingly. "But I was so frightened, Albert. Listen to me. I was so bewildered. And that long waiting there in that vast room since morning. Oh, that horrible waiting. I saw them all go, one after the other. The shoemaker and his wife, the coppersmith and his children from Stridge, and all those on the Kaiser and Victoria. But I remained. Tomorrow will be Sunday. They told me no one would come to fetch me. What if they sent me back? I was frantic." "Are you blaming me?" His voice was dangerous. No, of course not, Albert. I was just explaining." "Well, then let me explain," he said curtly. "I did what I could. I took the day off from the shop. I called that cursed Hamburg American line 4 times, and each time they told me you weren't on board. They didn't have any more third-class passage, so I had to take the steerage. Yes, now I know. That's all very well. That couldn't be helped. I came here anyway, the last boat. And what do? You refuse to recognize me. You don't know me." He dropped his elbows down on the rail, averted his angry face. "That's the greeting I get." "I'm sorry, Albert." She stroked his arm humbly. "I'm sorry. And if those blue-coated mongrels in there weren't mocking me enough, you'd give them that brat's right age. Didn't I write you to say 17 months because it would save the half fare? Didn't you hear me inside when I told them?" "How could I, Albert?" she protested. "How could I? You were on the other side of that cage." "Well, why didn't you say 17 months anyway? Look," he pointed to several blue-coated officials who came hurrying out of the doorway, out of the immigration quarters. "There they are." An ominous pride dragged at his voice. "If he's among them, that one who questioned me so much, I could speak to him if he came up here." "Don't bother with him, Albert," she exclaimed uneasily. "Please, Albert, what have you against him? He couldn't help it. It's his work." "Is it?" His eyes followed with unswerving deliberation the bluecoats as they neared the boat. "Well, he didn't have to do it so well. And after all, I did lie to him, Albert," she said hurriedly, trying to distract him. "The truth is you didn't," he snapped, turning his anger against her. "You made your first lie plain by telling the truth afterward, and made a laughing stock of me. I didn't know what to do. She picked despairingly at the wire grill beneath the rail. In Hamburg, the doctor laughed at me when I said 17 months. He's so big. He was big when he was born. She smiled, the worried look on her face vanishing momentarily as she stroked her son's cheek. Won't you speak to your father, David, beloved? The child merely ducked his head behind his mother. His father stared at him, shifted his gaze, and glared down at the officials. And then, as though perplexity had crossed his mind, he frowned absent-mindedly. How old did you say he was? How old did he say he was? The doctor? Over 2 years. And as I say, he laughed. Well, what did he enter? 17 months, I told you. Then why didn't you tell them 17? He broke off, shrugged violently. Bah, you need more strength in this land. He paused, eyed her intently, and then frowned suddenly. Did you bring his birth certificate? Why, she seemed confused. It may be in the trunk there on the ship, I don't know. Perhaps I left it behind. Her hand wandered uncertainly to her lips. I don't know, is it important? I never thought of it, but surely father could send it. We need only write. Well, put him down. His head jerked brusquely toward the child. You don't need to carry him all the way. He's big enough to stand on his own feet. She hesitated and then reluctantly set the child down on the deck. Scared, unsteady, the little one edged over to the side opposite his father and, hidden by his mother, clung to her skirt. Well, it's over now. She attempted to be cheerful. It's all behind us now, isn't it, Albert? Whatever mistakes I made don't really matter anymore, do they? A fine taste of what lies before me. He turned his back on her and leaned morosely against the rail. A fine taste. They were silent. On the dock below, the brown hawsers had been slipped over the mooring posts, and the men on the lower deck dragged them dripping from the water. Bells clanged, the ship throbbed. Startled by the hoarse bellow of her whistle, the gulls wheeling before her prow rose with slight creaking cry from the green water as she turned away from the stone quay, skimmed across her path on indolent scimitar wing. Behind the ship, the white wake that stretched to Ellis Island grew longer, raveling wanly into mellow green. On one side curved the low drab Jersey coastline, the spars and masts on the waterfront fringing the sky. On the other side was Brooklyn, flat, water-towered, the horns of the harbor. And before them, rising on her high pedestal from the scaling, swarmy brilliance of sunlit water to the west, Liberty. The spinning disk of the late afternoon sun slanted behind her, and to those on board who gazed, her features were charred with shadow, her depths exhausted, her masses ironed to one single plane. Against the luminous sky, the rays of her halo were spikes of darkness roweling the air. Shadow flattened the torch she bore to a black cross against flawless light, the blackened hilt of a broken sword, Liberty. The child and his mother stared again at the massive figure in wonder. The ship curved around in a long arc toward Manhattan, her bow sweeping past Brooklyn, and the bridges whose cables and pillars, superimposed by distance, spanned the East River in diaphanous and rigid waves. The western wind that raked the harbor into brilliant clods blew fresh and clear, a salt tang in the lull of its veerings. It whipped the polka dot ribbons on the child's hat straight out behind him. They caught his father's eye. Where'd you find that crown? Startled by his sudden question, his wife looked down. That was Maria's parting gift, the old nurse. She bought it herself and then sewed the ribbons on. You don't think it's pretty? Pretty? Do you still ask? His lean jaws hardly moved as he spoke. Can't you see those idiots lying back there watching us already? They're mocking us. What will the others do on the train? He looks like a clown in it. He's the cause of all this trouble anyway. The harsh voice, the wrathful glare, the hand flung toward the child frightened him. Without knowing the cause, he knew that the stranger's anger was directed at himself. He burst into tears and pressed closer to his mother. Quiet, the voice above him snapped. Cowering, the child wept all the louder. Hush, darling, his mother's protecting hand settled on his shoulders. Just when we're about to land, her husband said furiously, he begins this howling. And now we'll have it all the way home, I suppose. Quiet, you hear? It's you who are frightening him, Albert, she protested. Am I? Well, let him be quiet and take that straw gear off his head. But Albert, it's cool here. Will you take that off when I... A snarl choked whatever else he could have uttered. While his wife looked on, aghast, his long fingers scooped the hat from the child's head. The next instant, it was sailing over the ship's side to the green waters below. The overalled men in the stern grinned at each other. The old orange peddler shook her head and clucked. Albert, his wife caught her breath. How could you? I could, he rapped out. You should have left it behind. His teeth clicked and he glared about the deck. She lifted the sobbing child to her breast, pressed him against her. With a vacant, stunned expression, her gaze wandered from the grim, smoldering face of her husband to the stern of the ship. In the silvery green wake that curved trumpet-wise through the water, the blue hat still bobbed and rolled, ribbon stretched out on the waves. Tears sprang to her eyes. She brushed them away quickly, shook her head as if shaking off the memory, and looked toward the bow. Beside her, the grimy cupolas and towering square walls of the city loomed up. Above the jagged rooftops, the white smoke, whitened and suffused by the slanting sun, faded into the slots and wedges of the sky. She pressed her brow against her child's, hushed him with whispers. This was the vast, incredible land, the land of freedom, of immense opportunity, that golden land. Again, she tried to smile. Albert, she said timidly, Albert, will we weep together in New York? No, Brownsville, I already wrote to you. She nodded uncertainly, sighed. Screws threshing, backing water. Peter Stuyvesant neared her dock, drifting slowly and with canceled momentum, as if reluctant. So it's very short, but I hope you enjoyed it. You could, if you could unmute everyone, thank you.
Pay for it.
Excuse me?
I'm not going to bother adding everything up.
I'm sorry, I didn't understand that comment. Oh, she's on the phone.
Don't worry about
it. I just have a picture here of my son pointing to his great-grandfather's name on the wall at Ellis Island. He came from the Ukraine.
My father.
Anyone have any comments or questions?
My father was brought by his mother and 9 brothers and sisters from Russia in 1901, just a few years before the story occurred. He was 6 months old and was brought up in the most unbelievable poverty in the Lower East Side of Manhattan, which he never really wanted to talk about, so I don't know much about it at all.
I recommend reading this because it's a very detailed account of the tenements of the Lower East Side.
Really?
And it's really interesting because David, the boy, was bullied by others for a variety of reasons. His home language was Yiddish, but the street life was English, or English spoken by Irish.
It's a wonderful picture of the fear and all of being an immigrant, but you've read the whole book?
Yes.
The most grabbing thing to me was the anger of the father.
The father.
I mean, he was so, the husband, the father, the whatever.
Yeah.
It's beautifully portrayed, I mean, but that was scaring me because I've seen people like that in my grandparents' generation that were so beat down that it ended up being anger toward their family.
Well, he's pretty aloof and cruel until David has an accidental shock from trying to create light from the rail on the tram, which he's been taught by some ruffians in the neighborhood. He gets horribly shocked, and his father suddenly softens. I would imagine David would be about 8 or 9 at that point.
Okay. It's wonderful.
It's just a wonderful book. There's so many twists and turns, and yeah.
It's Harriet. I was going to say, my father came here from Belarus in 1907. He was 4 years old, and in my mind, he and his little brother came, or his older brother, he was 4, his brother was 6, came with their mother, and were met by the father. And in my mind, it was always it should have been a very pleasant, oh, so happy to see you, how was your trip? Nothing of the nastiness that was evoked in this man seeing his wife and child. And so I wondered what the reality was for my father and his brother and mother. How were they greeted? What was their life like shortly thereafter? What was their adjustment? It's another way for me to look. And of course, there's no one left to ask. So you just have to imagine.
Read the book.
And hope for the positive.
Right, right. I think, a lot of people had high hopes for streets paved with gold and great jobs, and they weren't forthcoming.
Mm-hmm. Oh, and by the way, my father didn't go to Ellis Island. He came into Washington Avenue, which is here in Philadelphia.
Yeah.
And those of you who don't know, it was an embarkation port that has been newly rededicated a couple years ago. And I just got an email from the woman who runs it saying that they're going to do more stories, and would I be included in what I've learned since. So I can keep you all posted because I think it's fascinating.
Mm.
I have a question for people. In my family, is my sound on?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Now it is.
My family doesn't have any history of recent immigration. And I was really curious to hear from folks about their different experiences. One man who I didn't recognize, whose name I don't remember, was commenting on how there wasn't this sense of immigrant pride, like that is, at least among my former students who were the first gens, who were encouraged to have this kind of immigrant pride. And I saw that it put a lot of pressure on them, not necessarily all good. So I'm curious to know how folks think things have changed, or what were your family stories about having pride in the roots in the home country, or being encouraged to assimilate?
Well, my father immigrated here when he was 5 years old, and he never wanted to talk about he came from Romania, and the only stories he ever would tell about Romania were it being chased through the woods by wolves, which he was a storyteller. And I never took that to be anything that really ever happened. It was his way of expressing his opinion of Romania. And he never wanted to talk about immigration or anything that happened here.
My father and his brothers and sisters wanted to become as American as they could as quickly as possible. And I think that was fairly typical of that generation.
Mm-hmm.
Education meant more than anything. One of them became a physician. My father became a dentist. Several of them became quite wealthy, and they achieved this American dream, which was all that they wanted.
Yeah.
They weren't religious at all, unlike I know other families.
I've heard some immigrants, and I was just thinking of Sotomayor. I can't remember her first name, but
Sonia.
one of the things that she said, and I've heard this from others, that to learn baseball was the way to assimilate.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, funny, because baseball is like bigger in Cuba than anywhere else.
Korea.
Margarita, I think you were trying to ask something, but I couldn't hear you. I still can't hear you. Can't hear you.
You're muted.
I think she needs to turn her mic on.
One thing you can do is you can go to the chat. You can highlight
Elise is
at the bottom and type in a question or comment.
Elise, you're muted as well.
And so is Barbara.
You have to turn your mic on.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Someone just hit the mute all button.
Yes.
You can hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, good. Well,
I was just kind of want to comment on some of the immigrant experience. My family were immigrants also. My father came here when he was about 2 or 3 years old with his older sister who was about 5 and his mother from Italy. And they came on Washington Avenue entrance. They didn't come to New York. And how they came through Washington Avenue is my father's father, my granddad, was a merchant marine sailor. And how he came to Philadelphia is he jumped ship. And he found his way to South Philly where some of his buddies from the old country were living. And once he found a place to stay and felt settled, he then sent a letter back to his wife, and then she came with the 2 children. And my father's comments about the only thing he really remembers of Italy is that the weather was always very sunny and rainstorms were really, really short. And he didn't really remember much of the country at all. But when it comes to Philadelphia, I mean, everybody where he was living spoke Italian. So it was like the old country got transported with him in a sense.
I think my parents also were immigrants. My father from Italy and my mother from Germany. And my father believed in education, became an engineer, research engineer. But the thing I think is sad, they were both fluent in those other languages. I remember them on the phone sometimes speaking their language to family, but they didn't want us to learn it. I mean, the war, and so as little kids, we would ask what this word meant and so on, but they didn't encourage us to absorb that. I mean, they would tell some stories, but not many, and it feels to me like we lost something that can't be regained, but you understand why the attitude was like that.
Sure.
So this is Mark speaking. When I look at all your pictures, I wonder if we all think that we have something in common, is that our parents, grandparents came over from Europe as immigrants.
Yeah.
And I don't think we think about that. We're in a crowd of people that are our age, but we have that one thing in common.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious. I've recently learned a little bit about my mother's parents, my grandfather and my father's father. And I'm curious, and there's no one to ask, how did they, when they came over, how did they find a way to make a living? Who was it that introduced them? Both of them managed apparently to make a very good living, but I don't know how they got into it when they first came here. And the children on my mother's side, my father's side, everybody was educated, but I don't know how they came over in the early 1900s and found a way to earn a living.
I tend to think that they came over and joined relatives who were already here, so that they lived with them and
or people from their village.
Yes.
Maybe.
And so you had to be met by somebody who was already here and established, and someone could vouch for you to come in and that you were healthy. So I think that's one way they got started.
They also remember the reason they got in so easily is because there were plenty of jobs here. It might not be the job you wanted, but there were plenty of jobs in factories. And
my grandfathers did not work in factories. They had a business. They each had a business. And so I'm very curious, how did they do that?
it is different.
Well, I know I never met my grandfather or my father, but I know how he established himself here in Philadelphia is after my father used to talk about it, and I have evidence of it in my apartment actually. What my grandfather did after he jumped ship, his buddies to the old country living in South Philly, is he found a quick way to make money. He got a cart, got a block of ice, and would go down to the seaport and get fish. And every day he would, with the bell attached to his little cart, he would walk through South Philly with the iced fish. He would sell the fish. And And that's how he made money to live. And once he felt he was making enough money on a regular basis, that's when he sent from his wife and his 2 children, which included my father. And I actually have the bell from his fish cart in my apartment.
Wow.
One of the bookshelves.
Wow.
And what
Cool.
happened after the kids were here, and he was here for years with his wife and children, then opened a little grocery store with produce and veggies and more fish on the first floor of the house they were living in South Philly.
I believe that the more recent immigrant, beginning with the Korean, but even earlier than that, Jewish organizations, benevolent societies began, where those that were here and established collected money, did fundraising, and helped new businesses get established. Now, I don't know at what point that began, but I do know that in the Korean community, it's a very strong benevolent society. In the Jewish community, the only thing that I recall is a lot of cemetery plots were bought by these organizations so that you could be buried in a community of people similar to you.
Well, everybody, it's been lovely, and I have another meeting at 6 on Zoom. So I'll look forward to this again. So nice to see you all, and please stay healthy.
Thank you. Thank you for joining. It's such a nice day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks for joining.
Thank you, Molly.
Fabulous.
You're welcome.
But this is
Bye-bye.
for Molly and Mark. It sounds like there's a lot of interest in exploring our roots and what it was like. I can hear from all the comments, we've segued away from the book as it is and began to talk more personally. And I think that would be a very interesting program or series of programs, or even columns in the newsletter as we go forward.
I totally agree. Great suggestion.
And I'd be interested in learning more about the Washington Pier.
Yes. Well, I think the question I was recently asked is, what have you learned since you began to do a little bit of research? And can we interview you? So I'll find out when that's going to happen. Obviously, the way they were going to do it has changed because of the virus and the stay-at-home order. So I think that they got stymied in their progress. So as soon as I know more, I will let you know. But I have learned a tremendous amount of information that I absolutely never knew before. But one other point I wanted to make, the person who asked, I think Olivia, it was you, about integration, how many people came in and wanted to be more American than their roots. And I think that for a lot of families, mine, I know in particular, more children were born once they were here. My father was one of 6, but he only came with he and his brother. And then once my grandmother was here, they had 4 more. And I think with the American-born children, it was easier to assimilate. So all my aunts and uncles were very American, but my grandmother, my paternal grandmother, really never learned English very well, never really moved outside of her community. And because of that, I rarely ever had a chance to talk with her and get even more information.
Yeah. It's interesting. One of the things that sounds like what I would expect. And then with my former students whose parents immigrated and they were born in the US, most of them, they didn't speak English well, the students. And they didn't want to. They didn't want to, assimilate. I mean, they wanted to get through because people were putting pressure on them, like go to college, blah, blah, blah. But they, even born in the US, not being able to speak English well. It was amazing to me.
Interesting, yeah. I think we've gone through a period of where assimilation in many communities was lessened by the need for identity and maybe self-preservation. So
Yeah.
I was in graduate school at the end of the 70s when the Black Pride movement arose. And I remember at graduation, the members of our class that were African American all decided they would walk in together. And so I think I think we in this country have gone through those various periods of self-identity and group identity rather than assimilation.
Yeah, I know nothing about it really other than just anecdotes. So it's kind of fascinating. And also to try to help people be proud of their heritage and also fully participating.
This is Linda. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Most of the stories that people have been sharing have been about people that came to the city, one city or the other. I never knew my mother's parents, but my father's parents, their parents had come here early. My grandmother was born in 1884, and she was born here, and she was one of 11 children. And they were farmers in the Norristown area, which was a very rural area at that time. And I don't know how it happened, but they had a huge farm, so large that my grandmother's father, she was one of 10 girls in the family, and he was able to give 10 acres to each of them and still have a large farm left for himself. She didn't accept that because my grandfather was too proud to take that. He wanted to make his way on his own, and he was a harness maker, and he had his own shop in Norristown as a harness maker. But that until he was like not quite retirement age, that had disappeared. And he sold his shop and worked for another harness maker that was a little farther out in Phoenixville. But then that disappeared too. And he ended up, he was probably close to 70 at that point. He became a janitor at the Wonder Bakery that was in Norristown, and used to bring home this wonderful freshly baked bread that smelled so great. But anyway, that was a different experience, I guess. There were many people that came here and farmed. They were able to make a living as farmers in that time.
And harness makers.
Yes.
Yes.
Well, Vineland, South Jersey is very well known for their farm, for all the immigrants that went there.
Yeah, I bet there's some, I know that I've read a book on a local history buff who's written several books. I've forgotten his name. I'll look it up. Maybe we could get somebody like him or somebody who specializes in genealogy or local immigrant history to come talk to us.
That'd be great.
Yeah. I'll investigate.
Okay. Bye, Mark. Thank you all for joining. I'll sign off now.
Okay.
Thank
Nice
you.
to see everyone.
See you at the next time.
Thank you.
See you at the happy hour.